Reincarnation and the Law of Karma by William Walker Atkinson, 1908. The Egyptians, Chaldeans, Druids, etc. After considering the existence of the doctrines of reincarnation among the primitive peoples, and its traditional existence among the vanished peoples of the past, we find ourselves irresistibly borne toward that ancient land of mystery, the home of the mystics and occultists of the past, the land of Isis, the home of the builders of the pyramids, the people of the Sphinx. Whether these people were the direct descendants of the people of destroyed Atlantis, the home of the ancient wisdom, or whether they were a new people who had rediscovered the old doctrines, the fact remains that when tracing back any old occult or mystic doctrine, we find ourselves gradually led toward the land of the Sphinx as the source of that hidden truth. The Sphinx is a fit emblem of that wonderful race. Its sealed lips seem to invite the ultimate questions, and one feels that there may be a whispered answer wafted from those tightly closed lips toward the ear that is prepared to hear and receive it. And so, in our search for the origin of reincarnation, we find ourselves once more confronting the Egyptian Sphinx, as we have done so often before in our search after truth. Notwithstanding its obvious prehistoric origin, many have claimed that metempsychosis has its birthplace in Old Egypt, on the banks of the Nile. India disputes this claim, holding that the Ganges, not the Nile, gave birth to the doctrine. Well, be that as it may, we shall treat the Egyptian conception at this place among the ancient lands holding the doctrine, for in India it is not a thing of the past, but a doctrine which has its full flower at the present time, and which flower is sending forth its subtle odor to all parts of the civilized world. And so we shall defer our consideration of India's teachings until we reach the present stage of the history of reincarnation. Herodotus, many centuries ago, said of the Egyptians that, quote, "The Egyptians are the first who propounded the theory that the human soul is imperishable, and that where the body of one dies, it enters into some other body that may be ready to receive it, and that when it has gone the round of all created forms on land, in water, and in air, then it once more enters the human body born for it, and that this cycle of existence for the soul takes place in 3,000 years. End of quote by Herodotus. Well, the doctrine of reincarnation is discernible, though hidden away amidst the mass of esoteric doctrine back of the exoteric teachings of the Egyptians, which latter were expounded to the common people, while the truth was reserved for the few who were ready for it. The inner circles of the Egyptian mystics believed in and understood the inner truths of reincarnation, and although they guarded the esoteric teachings carefully, still fragments fell from the table and were greedily taken up by the masses, as we may see by an examination of the scraps of historical records which have been preserved, graven in the stone and imprinted on the bricks. Not only did these people accept the doctrine of reincarnation, but Egypt was really the home of the highest occult teachings. The doctrines and teachings regarding several sheaths or bodies of man, which are taught by occultists of all times and races, are believed to have been fully taught in their original purity on the banks of the Nile, and in the shadow of the pyramids, yes, even before the days of the pyramids. Their 40 centuries of history saw many modifications of the philosophical and religious beliefs. But the fundamental doctrine of reincarnation was held to during the entire period of history in ancient Egypt, and was not discarded until the decadent descendants of the once mighty race were overwhelmed by stronger races, whose religions and beliefs superseded the vestiges of the ancient doctrine. The Egyptians held that there was Ka, that's K-A, the divine spirit in man, Ab, A-B, the intellect or will, Hati, that's H-A-T-I, the vitality, Tet, T-E-T, the astral body, Sahu, S-A-H-U, the etheric double, and Za, that's X-A, the physical body. Some authorities forming a slightly different arrangement, which correspond to the various bodies of man as recognized by occultists today. The ancient Chaldeans also taught the doctrine of rebirth. The body of Persian and Chaldean mystics and occultists known as the Magi, who were masters of the hidden wisdom, held to the doctrine of reincarnation as one of their fundamental truths. In fact, they managed to educate the masses of their people to a much higher point than the masses of the Egyptians did. And escaping the idolatrous tendencies of the Egyptian populace, they manifested a very high degree of pure philosophical, occult, and religious knowledge. The Magi taught that the soul was a complex being, and that certain portions of it perished, while certain other parts survived and passed on through a series of earth and otherworld existences, until finally it attained such a degree of purity that it was relieved of the necessity of further incarnation, and thenceforth dwelt in the region of ineffable bliss, the region of light eternal. The teaching also held that just before entering into that state of bliss, the soul was able to review its previous incarnations, seeing distinctly the connection between them, and thus gaining a store of the wisdom of experience, which would aid it in its future work as a helper of future races, which would appear on the face of the earth. The Magi taught that as all living things, nay, all things having existence, organic or inorganic, were but varying manifestations of the one life and being. Therefore, the highest knowledge implied a feeling of conscious brotherhood and relationship toward and with all. Even among the Chinese, there was an esoteric teaching concerning reincarnation, beneath the outer teaching of ages past. It may be discerned in the teachings of the early philosophers and seers of the race, notably in the works of Lao Tzu, the great Chinese sage and teacher. Lao Tzu, or Lao Tzu, whose great work, the Tao Te Ching, or Tao Te Ching, is a classic. It taught reincarnation to his inner circle of students and adherents, at least so many authorities claim. He taught that there existed a fundamental principle called Tao, T-A-O, which is held to have been identical with the primordial reason, a manifestation of which was the Te, T-E-H, or the creative activity of the universe. From the union and action of the Tao and the Te proceeded the universe, including the human soul, which he taught was composed of several parts, among them being the Huen, H-U-E-N, or the spiritual principle, and the Phi, the P-H-I, or semi-material vital principle, which together animate the body. Lao Tzu said, quote, "To be ignorant that the true self is immortal is to remain in a grievous state of error, and to experience many calamities by reason thereof. Know ye that there is a part of man which is subtle and spiritual, and which is the heaven-bound portion of himself. That which has to do with flesh, bones, and body belongs to the earth, earthly to earth, heavenly to heaven. Such is the law." End of quote. Some have held that Lao Tzu taught the immediate return of the Huen to the Tao after death. But from the writings of his early followers, it may be seen that he really taught that the Huen persisted in individual existence throughout repeated incarnations, returning to the Tao only when it has completed its round of experienced life. For instance, in the Sai-Hai, that's S-I-H-A-E-I, it is said that, quote, "The vital essence is dispersed after death together with the body, bones, and flesh, but the soul, or knowing principle of the self, is preserved and does not There is no immediate absorption of the individuality into the Tao, for individuality persists and manifests itself according to the law. End of quote. And Shuangzi said, quote, death is but the commencement of a new life. End of quote. It was also taught by the early Taoists that the deeds, good and evil, of the present life would bear fruit in future existences, in addition to the orthodox heavens and hells in which the Chinese believed, and of which they had a great variety adapted to the requirements of the various grades of saints and sinners, the minute details of which places being described with that intention to minor details and particulars peculiar to the Chinese mind. The teachings of a later date, that the soul of the ancestor abided in the hall of the ancestors, and so on, were a corruption of the ancient teaching. Other Chinese teachers taught that the soul consists of three parts. The first being the kui, K-U-E-I, which had its seat in the belly, and which perished with the body. The second being the ling, L-I-N-G, which had its seat in the heart or chest, and which persisted for some time after death, but which eventually disintegrated. And the third, or Huan, H-U-E-N, which had its seat in the brain, and which survived the disintegration of its companions, and then passed on to other existences. As strange as it may appear to many readers unfamiliar with this subject, the ancient Druids, particularly those dwelling in ancient Gaul, were familiar with the doctrine of reincarnation and believed in its tenets. These people, generally regarded as ancient barbarians, were really possessed of a philosophy of a high order, which merged into a mystic form of religion. Many of the Romans, among their conquest of Gallia, were surprised at the degree and character of the philosophical knowledge possessed by the Druids, and many of them have left written records of the same, notably in the case of Aristotle, Caesar, Lucan, and Valerius Maximus. The Christian teachers who succeeded them also bore witness to these facts, as may be seen by reference to the works of Saint Clement, Saint Cyril, and other of the early Christian fathers. These ancient, so to speak, barbarians entertained some of the highest spiritual conceptions of life and immortality, the mind and the soul. Renaud has written of them, basing his statements upon a careful study of the ancient beliefs of this race. Quote, if Judea represents in the world, with a tenacity of its own, the idea of a personal and absolute God. If Greece and Rome represent the idea of society, Gaul represents, just as particularly, the idea of immortality. Nothing characterized it better, as all the ancients admit. That mysterious folk was looked upon as the privileged possessor of the secrets of death. And its unwavering instinctive faith in the persistence of life never ceased to be a cause of astonishment and sometimes of fear in the eyes of the heathen. End of quote. The Gauls possessed an the Gauls possessed an occult philosophy and a mystic religion which were destroyed by the influences of the Roman conquest. The philosophy of the Druids bore a remarkable resemblance to the inner doctrine of the Egyptians and their successors, the Grecian mystics. Traces of Hermeticism and Pythagoreanism are clearly discernible, although the connecting link that bound them together has been lost to history. Legends among the Druids connected their order with the ancient Aryan creeds and teachings, and there seems to have been a very close connection between these priests and those of ancient Greece. For there are tales of offerings being sent to the temples of Greece from the priests of Gaul. And it is also related that on the island of Delphos there was once a Druidic tomb in the shape of a monument believed to have been erected over the remains of Druid priestesses. Herodotus and others speak of a secret alliance between the priests of Greece and those of the Druids. Some of the ancient legends hold that Pythagoras was the instructor of the Druidic priests, and that Pythagoras himself was in close communication with the Brahmins of India and the Hermeticists of Egypt. Other legends have it that the Druids received their first instruction from Somalius, who had been a slave and a student of Pythagoras. At any rate, the correspondence between the two schools of philosophy is remarkable. Much of the Druidic teachings has been lost, and it is difficult to piece together the fragments. But enough is known to indicate the above-mentioned relationship to the Pythagorean school, and of the firm hold of the doctrine of reincarnation upon the Druids. The preserved fragments show that the Druids taught that there was in man an immaterial spiritual part, called Awen, A-W-E-N, which proceeded from an universal spiritual principle of life. They taught that this Awen had animated the lower forms of life, mineral, vegetable, and animal, before incarnating as man. In those conditions, it was entangled and imprisoned in the state of abysmal circling called Anufu, A-N-U-F-U, from which it finally escaped and entered into the circle of freedom called Abred, A-B-R-E-D, or human incarnation and beyond. This state of Abred includes life in the various human races on this and other planets, until finally there is a further liberation of the Awen, which then passes on to the circle of bliss, or Gwynfid, G-W-Y-N-F-I-D, where it abides for eons in a state of ecstatic being. But beyond even this transcendent state, there is another, which is called the circle of the infinite, or the Seugent, roughly pronounced, spelled C-E-U-G-A-N-T, which is identical with the union of God of the Persians and the Greek mystics, or the nirvana of the Hindus. Rather an advanced form of philosophy for barbarians, is it not? Particularly when contrasted with the crude mythology of the Roman conquerors. The Gauls were so advanced in the practical phases of occultism that they gave every condemned criminal a respite of 5 years after sentence of death before execution, in order that he might prepare himself for a future state by meditation, instruction, and other preparation, and also to prevent ushering an unprepared and guilty soul into the plane of the departed, the advantages of which plan is apparent to every student of occultism who accepts the teaching regarding the astral planes. Now you will understand, of course, that the degree of advancement in spiritual and philosophical matters evidenced by the Gauls was due not to the fact that these people were generally so far advanced beyond their neighbors, but rather to the fact that they had been instructed by the Druid priests among them. Tradition has it that the original Druidic priests came to Gaul and other countries from some far-off land, probably from Egypt or Greece. We have spoken of the connection between their teachings and that of the Pythagoreans or the Pythagoreans. And there was undoubtedly a strong bond of relationship between the priests and the occultists of other lands. The Druidic priests were well versed in astronomy and astrology, and the planets had an important part in the teachings. A portion of their ritual is said to have correspondences with the early Jewish rites and worship. Their favorite symbol, the mistletoe, was used as indicating rebirth, the mistletoe being the new life springing forth from the old one, typified by the oak. The Druids traveled into ancient Britain and Ireland, and many traces of their religious rites may still be found there, not only in the shape of the stone places of worship, but also in many curious local customs among the peasantry. Many a bit of English folklore, many an odd Irish fancy concerning fairies and the like, as symbols of good luck, banshees, and the little folk, came honestly to these people from the days of the Druids. And from the same source came the many whispered tales among both races regarding the birth of children who seemed to have remembrances of former lives on earth, which memory faded away as they grew older. Among these people there is always an undercurrent of mystic ideas about souls coming back in some mysterious way not fully understood. It is the inheritance from the Druids. The next video will be Chapter 3, the Romans and Greeks.